have robbed me, but I have not forgotten thy law. At midnight will I rise to give thanks unto thee because of thy righteous judgments, O Lord. I am a companion of all them that fear thee, and of them that keep thy precepts. The earth, O Lord, is full of thy mercy. Teach me thy statutes. Thou hast dealt well with thy servants, O Lord, according to thy...
Good morning. Welcome to Line by Line Bible Studies. Continuing the book of Psalms. We're covering some number of the chapters of the books of Psalms, and then we're going to go do something else, and we'll come back. It's a lot to do at once, and I don't want to get sick of doing Psalms. I don't think I would, honestly, but that's the way we're going to do it in any case. So we talked about the blessing on the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scornful. We covered the first 3 verses. His delight is in the law of the Lord. His law he doth meditate day and night. And he shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water, that bringeth forth his fruit in his season. And Jesus always emphasized that the bringing forth the fruit was an essential component. Not to earn salvation, but it is a mark of salvation. It is something that manifests because of the work of God in us. If the work of God is happening in us, we have fruit. And those without the work of God have not fruit, or they have fruit that is on examination found to be not good. It is not just fruit we must bring forth, but good fruit, as the Lord said. The ungodly are not so. Is that little... I don't know. I don't know if that crackling comes through. I'm going to watch that again. I thought I saw it in my meters there. The ungodly are not so, but are like the chaff which the wind driveth away. Therefore the ungodly shall not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord knoweth the way of the righteous, but the way of the ungodly shall perish. So, again, I have to say it because, I know I don't like to, I don't like to offend people, but I don't care on some level if some people find it offensive, if I think it's true and worth saying and valuable. You can say things that are true that are not really a great idea to say at a particular time. So you could say some nasty detail of someone's life at their funeral, to someone who loves them. That would be maybe not a good truth to say. It's the truth. Not all truths are created equal. And it's not always like a great time to say certain things. But I'm going to point out here, it's throughout, one of the things I talk about when I talk about the judgment of God. One of the things that I think it makes it difficult for Christians to talk about the judgment of God, it's kind of because on the one hand, modern Christianity is a very soft Christianity. It doesn't really believe in itself in many ways. So, Paul, there's lots of zealous Christians. Yeah, get them talking about hell. They don't like to talk about hell because it's a terrible subject. Because the things that popped into my mind as I read this, it's like when it says, the ungodly shall not... the way the ungodly shall perish. You could on some level say, well, no, it won't. No, it won't. They're going to live forever in torment. And that's what the way of the ungodly gives you. Now, you could, of course, say, there are definitely other ways to handle that. Okay, there's ways you can say, well, it's the way that's perishing, or that perish is merely a metaphor for what's actually going to happen, which is they shall be tormented with an excruciating torment, with a never-ending torment, which shall never cease, which is the traditional view in West, at least in the West. It hasn't always been the only view, and it is still to this day not the only view. But in our popular understanding of Christianity, to most people, it is the only view. And all the other views are people who just don't take the Bible seriously. When I really think that's not true and not fair. What it means is, because I am to interpret this in a metaphorical sense. And even though passages like this will occur over and over in the Bible, and in the Bible it'll talk about destroying souls and death and a second death, and all these terms which refer to earthly things which I understand full well. And I observe, everyone observes all the time. The 2 or 3 references to torment, and there's like one unmistakable reference where it says shall be tormented forever and ever in connection with the lake of fire. There's the tormented day and night in the presence of the Lamb at his coming. But again, that in the presence of the Lamb, that's a very direct thing, in his presence. Whereas at the same time in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, it says that the punishment of the wicked shall be eternal. I don't want to use the word separation, but it's where they get the idea of eternal separation from God, because they'll say the eternal torment is eternal separation from God. But in Revelation in chapter 14, it is in his presence that they feel torment, whereas it says, but their final fate in 1 Thessalonians chapter 1 is to be basically banished from his presence. And as I would point out in places, it's like, do not I fill heaven and earth? Whither shall, or it says in the Psalms, which Psalm? I can't remember off the top of my head. We'll get to it eventually. But you can look it up through the words. It's not hard to find if you search hard. Whither shall I flee from thy presence? Where shall I go? From your spirit, I think it says. If I ascend, you can look up this word for the King James. If I ascend into heaven, thou art there. If I descend into hell, behold, thou art there. Heaven and hell. I don't know if that's in the same verse. Let's see. Let me just see. I'll find that real fast. I ascend. This is not Google, so I don't know. I'm sure you could search it on Google or any other good search engine. I don't want to make it like Google's like the only search engine in the world. I shouldn't have done the phrase. Okay. I'll probably get it here. Psalm 139 verse 8. 139 verse 8. I'm sorry I didn't take you long for finding the verse. Where's my... And I don't want to beat this over the head all the time. I know a lot of the people who study with me probably already agree. But in the event they don't, and in the event that you need reminding, which we all need reminding of everything all the time, at least I do, and I'm usually complimented on my good memory, but it's not a perfect memory, since all this is done from just the top of my head. If I ascend up to heaven, I like verse 7, whither shall I go from thy spirit, and whither shall I flee from thy presence? It's talking to the Lord. If I ascend up to heaven, thou art there. If I make my bed in hell, behold, thou art there. Now that's hell in Sheol, which refers to the place of death. There's multiple words translated hell in the New Testament. Anyways, I want to point out, so it's talking about the grave. God is everywhere. And what I'm saying about that is like, whether we live or die, God is there. So what is it to be? Well, and then again, I make my bed in hell. Notice he places himself in the grave. Thou art there. That's probably because he's looking forward to the resurrection. And but in true death, meaning like the idea of where you cease to exist. In the cessation from existence, one could truly be separated from God. Because God exists, and things that don't exist are distinct and separate from God. Separated, indeed. Should I mention that verse? I'm not trying to prove anything here. I'm just trying to make... We will run into stuff like this all throughout the Psalms. And, the language and the metaphors concerning the wicked are of their utter removal and destruction. It's not of the wicked, like the Old Testament. You think the Old Testament, which people say, yeah, in the Old Testament God's real harsh, in the New Testament He's all happy and gentle. But what's funny is none of the scriptures that inspire people to believe in an eternal torture chamber come from the Old Testament. In fact, you can't find anything there. Nothing. I know of nothing. I've never heard anyone even suggest a single scripture from the Old Testament can be used to defend the traditional Western Christian belief about hell. I only say Western because I don't know what they believe elsewhere. I don't know what the other traditions are. I'm not going to speak for it universally. The Catholic tradition. And not that it being Catholic renders it automatically suspect. Though being a tradition or being traditional does not render it automatically something we should assume is correct. And why did I bring that up? Oh, yeah. Oh, I just wanted to... Here's the verse where they get the separation clause. I'm going to put it up there just because I mentioned it in 1:9. 2 Thessalonians 1:9. But in flaming fire, talking about Jesus being revealed, in flaming fire taking vengeance on them that know not God, and that obey not the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ, who shall be punished with everlasting destruction from the presence of the Lord and from the glory of His power. And I will tell you that I've studied the Bible for a long time, and the majority of the language concerning the ultimate fate of the wicked is much more like you see in Psalm 1 and 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, and like you would see in Matthew 10:28, fear not them that destroy the body, and can do nothing more to you, but fear Him which can destroy the soul. The words of destruction, and we say, well, that means torture. It's it also talks about death. It talks about the final fate of the wicked as being death, and the righteous shall live, the wicked shall die. Well, it means a metaphorical death. It's actually they're held alive and captive in a strange alternative reality or extra-dimensional torture chamber where they are excluded from God's presence, yet they are still alive and kept alive, and the torment never ceases. And they're like, well, what is it? And I remember I had a pastor, he said, it's not a medieval torture chamber, no. It's just separation from God, and they feel this tremendous pain from being separated from God because they so badly want to be unified with Him, I guess. I'm like, yeah, but it's worse than that, right? I mean, it's worse than a medieval torture chamber. Well, yes, actually, he admitted. Yes, it's actually, even though this is not a crude, it's like, even though it's not a crude medieval torture chamber, it is somehow worse to be separated from God. So it's like, I almost see a scene from a movie or something. Like, what, are you going to torture me? You gonna cut me and burn me with pokers and waterboard me and put the thumb screws in, put me on the rack? Oh no, we're not going to do that. We're not barbarians. Oh, good relief. No, it's going to be much worse than that. And that shows you the prevailing attitude about hell. For some reason, there's this arms race of, whatever you can think the most horrible thing could happen, this is even worse. It's like this strange, almost childish thing. And there's no scriptural evidence for having that attitude or having that sort of I'm obligated to. Says Jesus even talked about it being more tolerable for some in the day of judgment than for others. and among not in terms of good and bad, but among the bad, they would be more tolerable for some than others. Some shall be punished with many stripes, and some with few. It never says any will be punished with infinite stripes. The law of God himself says, you shall not punish a man above 40 lashes, lest your brother seem vile unto you. Meaning that God saw it in the Old Testament as dehumanizing, essentially, to whip a man more than 40 times. Like enough is enough. And it's a principle that enough is enough. The idea that enough is never enough with God is a ridiculous caricature and really is a shameful thing that is taught in Christianity, in my opinion. It is because while we have all this evidence of perish, destruction, death, all these scriptures that will say death is the end, that's it for them. They'll take a few passages which use other symbology or metaphors or spiritual ideas, and they'll say, no, actually these things are literally true. And all that other stuff, that would be odd. And they use more metaphors to describe the end of the wicked than they do actual facts. And I find that difficult to grasp. I find it very difficult to grasp. You have to take in all the scriptures into account, and you have to weigh them in a balance on some level. I mean, it is possible that most of the time it could be speaking in metaphors. And then you have the passages where it talks about torment. And it's like, actually, for the first time, God is revealing what is really meant by death. You could say that. I mean, maybe that's the interpretation. I'm not saying that it's some sort of like, that there's no grounds for interpreting things that way. I'm just saying it's like, that seems to me the most objectionable and odd way to go about it. Like, it's almost like an enemy came in and told us to make the most inconvenient and slanderous interpretation of God's word. I mean, it's essentially, in my opinion, ultimately, the way hell is taught is essentially a slander on God's character. That it's like, that's what he does. It's essentially a slander brought in on God's character. And I suppose that could offend people, saying that the thing they believe is actually slanderous. And maybe I could understand why that would offend some people. I wouldn't want to be told my doctrine is a slander against God. But it's just how I feel. All right, let's look at the actual verses. I mean, just because I saw that, and I'm like, it's the first thing that came into my head. The ungodly are not so. They're not like a tree planted by rivers of waters that brings forth fruit and leaves that do not wither. You know? Now, it's talking about earthly life, but it's also, life is life. When you're alive, certain things are true. You know? But according to the teaching I've been talking about, it's like, their leaf doesn't wither. No matter how long you burn it, it never withers. It just feels pain. Of course, we couldn't ascribe to them prosperity. No, that's not a prosperous situation, is it? Anyways, the wicked their analogy, the simile here is, they're like the chaff which the wind driveth away. Chaff, when you, it's like very small dust created by agricultural activity, specifically the, I don't know if the right word is winnowing, but the separation of the grain from the rest of the plant-based material, the rest of the, you harvest, they go out and they grab a bunch of grass and they harvest with their sickle, right? And they have all these bundles of grain, and they separate the grain from the straw. And then even if you have a bunch of grain, right, it has to be separated from the husk and all that. And so they would beat it out, and then to loosen everything. And then they would use a fork to lift it in the air. This is a crude description, okay? They'd use a fork to lift it in the air, and they would flip it in the air, and all this stuff would go in there, and the dense grain would fall right back down to the ground, whereas the chaff, which is the less dense little bits and flakes of plant material that's still connected to the grain, the little tiny bits, it gets kind of taken with the wind. And, having a nice little wind when you're separating the chaff from the wheat is something you hear a lot in the scripture, is useful because the wind will just blow that away, but the grain will fall to the ground. So you keep flipping these grains up, and as you do this, it's like a process of blowing out all the fine material that is undesirable with the grain. And the chaff the term comes up a lot in the prophets and in the Psalms and in the Old Testament and even in the New Testament. And it is often used as what you could say the properties of chaff. It's very light. It's highly combustible. Highly combustible. It's the kind of thing. It's like if you had a handful of chaff, you could throw it in a fire and highly combustible. It says he will burn them like the chaff. There's another. The Bible note says he will burn them like a stone. I will burn them like a stone that has a very high melting temperature, except I won't exceed that melting temperature. So they will just be really hot, but undisturbed, undestroyed, but very, very hot. Another thing I would point out that is if you could be burned and not destroyed, why would there be pain? I guess that's why they go to the mental anguish angle. That's why they say it's like, no, it's not physical pain. Of course not. That wouldn't make sense. Because if you can burn me, and it doesn't destroy my body, or they'll say like, well, it destroys your body, but your body then heals up real fast. That's God. If that's the case, then God is really active in hell. You know what I mean? Making sure people get burned and making sure they get healed up. Or he's got some angels in charge of that. It's really, come on. To me, personally, I just think it's just fairy tales and garbage. It's meant to scare children at night. Sometimes I just get so sick of it that I have to live and deal with it. But, this is the way God, but also God has ordained that it should be so. Just as Christ was made a laughing stock, it's like God has made a gazing stock and a laughing stock, and men misunderstand and mock and all that stuff. And as it says in Moses that he would shroud himself in the thick darkness and hide himself from the eyes of men. God is not easy to find. You have to really want to find God in order to find him. You can't just assume. Some people are lucky and God just ups and goes after them. How nice is that? I'm late today because I had to reboot my computer because the microphone was giving me all this scratchiness. And now I can see my audio is going off with everything else. So hold on a second. We don't have to hold on. We can continue studying. I'm just going to lose the picture for a moment. Okay, let's see. The ungodly are there like the chaff with the wind driveth away. So the analogy of the wind driving away is something commonly. Hold on, here we go. I don't think I can talk and do this at the same time. I'm gonna just close off my camera, turn it back on, and hopefully when it comes back on, we are synchronized. Yeah, it's a little better. Yep, I was seeing like about a quarter-second lag. Oh, and that does I used to think maybe that doesn't go through, but it goes through. It ends up in the stream, and then you get this weird thing where my mouth is not synchronized. And that's fine if you're not watching, but if you are, I'm sure it's annoying. All right. His leaf also shall not wither, and the wicked are like the chaff which the wind driveth away. They are like a very light thing. They are not, in the earth they are heavy, but before God, they are not something of any substance at all. You know, the idea of the righteous are like this good seed which God planted in his field, you know, and they are like the good seed which the harvestman gathers together. He shall gather the corn into his barn, but the chaff shall he burn with unquenchable fire. That's in the Gospels. And a lot of people say, well, it's unquenchable fire, see? It's like, what does that say at all? Except that it's chaff. What happens when chaff meets unquenchable fire? Do you think the chaff hangs around? Does the chaff? I mean, that analogy does not lend itself, but it's unquenchable fire. The very idea of unquenchable fire is not really. It's only a very simple mind. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say it like that. But it's only a very unattentive person, only a very unattentive thought that is going to hear unquenchable fire and assume that means that oh well, that confirms the idea of eternal torment, because if you're going to properly torture someone, you would quench the fire. You would appoint them a moderate fire to torment them, just like, you know, a drip of water, like the Chinese water torture I always heard about when I was a kid. You know, it's like drip, drip, drip on your forehead. You know, that drive you insane. Any time, or any sort of, you know, you don't say, I'm going to torture you, I'm going to cut your head off. No, you can say, I'm going to cut your little finger off. That's how you torture someone. But anyways, the word, even in the New Testament, torment, means to conduct a sort of inquiry. By implication, to torture, to torment. It means to torment, basanismo. It means to test metals by touching them to the stone. You know what I mean? And by implication, it is the word used for torment. But it is not necessarily, that does not necessarily mean that should be interpreted in the most literal sense and overthrow everything else that the scriptures teach us about life and death. And it's funny because it's a much more elegant picture can be painted. And it also helps us understand things like evil better. When you understand, and the judgment of God, ultimately, we understand the fairness of it. It's much more easy to explain how fair everything is, or how unfair it is if you want, because oftentimes I'll say that God is not fair. He's much more than fair. He's very generous, especially to those, but he's not equally generous to all. That's why people say it's not fair. And on that level, it is not fair. But again, if God was generous to all equally, that also would be, in a sense, not fair. It just depends on where you're measuring the scale. Where do you put the scale? Because it's like, if God were to be equally generous to everyone who ever lived, were to inherit eternal life, well, what about all the people who never lived? And I don't mean abortions and stuff like that or miscarriages. I mean all the other sperm and egg combinations that just never happened. They're just not part of God's plan. You know, I could have had a twin brother. He wasn't part of God's plan. I have two brothers, but I could have had a third. My parents could have squeezed one in there. My wife and I have 8 children. We could have had 9. I mean, we could still have 9. It could happen. But if we don't, what about that person? Well, how is that fair to them? Well, they don't exist. They don't matter. Well, I don't know. I didn't exist at one time, but I'm pretty sure it matters to me now. I mean, like on some cosmic level, it matters. It matters. People try to tell me that that's not really a point. I'm like, no, I think you're wrong. It matters. It's inconvenient for the way you think about reality. It's inconvenient for the way people think about things. To think about the fact that even if we were all to receive eternal life and the best of everything and candy canes and unicorns, it would be fair. It's not fair. That's what leads to people being unthankful, unholy, unrighteous, because they do not recognize the generosity of God from the beginning. That a child that a child that is aborted in the first trimester is the recipient of God's generosity. As far as from God's perspective, his mother is not doing him particularly any favors, but he is already the recipient of great generosity that he has any part in life. Even though he never sees the sun, and that's a tragedy and all that. It is a tragedy. It's terrible. But if I decide, my wife and I, we decide we're not going to have any more kids, that's also a tragedy for some child who never is going to be. And I think back. My 8 children and I love all of them. Which ones, would I go back and say like, let's just not have that one. We'll erase them from, by just not choosing to conceive them. Do I want to go back in the past and make that the truth? No, not now. Not now that I know them. I've seen their face. But when you don't know them and you never see their face, it's like they're, you ever see people in dreams who you've never seen before? I mean, we know there are other people that could be. Potential people don't exist, but they are a potential. And when you talk about fairness, you got to think about potential. You have perspective from God's perspective. The living are all who he intends to live. And it's never fair. The generosity of God is not unlimited. It's something he intentionally puts to the limits. He doesn't have to. He could have unlimited. What would that look like? I mean, maybe in a sense, maybe in alternative universes, everyone is receiving of the generation. Maybe it's bigger than I realize. All right, I never find that written, but I certainly don't know everything. I'm just saying from what has been revealed in the scriptures, I don't think so. What is revealed in our reality about death and life, I don't think so. If we want to live and prosper, we cannot be like the ungodly. You know what? Last time I said that, it's hard to say what is ungodly. Well, we know what the godly are like. Blessed are the righteous, but blessed are they, the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly. But what he delights in the law of God. That's the first thing, is that the in law we talked about is direction. God says this is the way to do things or not to do things, but this is the direction. I think in the sense of a director or a instructor, saying, giving orders or directions like, look at, do this, do that. But don't do this, don't do that. Right? We have to give heed to the directions of God, to the instruction. I like direction because it means to point the way. Like directions. Okay. And law is a direction, meaning to direct. Not a direction in space. A moral direction, a directive. That's a good way to say it. I like that one. The law is a directive. The ungodly are those who do not give heed or delight in the directives of God. Because they do not ally themselves with God in their hearts, they are ungodly, impious. I don't know if the word is literally not. I doubt all the words translated ungodly in the New Testament and the Old Testament means usually not. And we'll look this up here real quick. It usually does not mean something like not of God, literally, like atheos or atheist or something like atheist. It's the ungodly, not the those who do not believe in God or those who are not of God or something like that. It just means, though you could say that of them. Yeah, ungodly is rasha, and it's one of the main words for wicked in the Hebrew language. Oh, I didn't bring that up. All right, let's do it. Come on, Paul. I get so lazy with this thing because it's like, okay, flip it around, flip it up, click, 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 click. Rasha, wicked or criminal. New American Standard Bible. From rasha, morally wrong, concrete and actively bad person. Condemned, guilty, ungodly, wicked, that did wrong. Forms and transliterations. Well, you can see on the right here, this is the Englishman's Concordance here. This is a very prevalent word in the Old Testament. It occurs, and that means just in this form, 262 times. It's a big word. The wicked, the ungodly here. The New Testament has actually many more words for those. And the New Testament word translated wicked often means impious or irreligious, actually. Though occasionally it is just wicked. Rasha here is the wicked. All right? those who do not heed God's direction, they don't delight in God's. Because it's not just that. It's like, let's say you receive the direction of God. It says, you may not know right from wrong, right? And then all of a sudden, it comes to you, hey, you shouldn't do that. That's wrong. The righteous delight. And so I shouldn't. It's wrong. I want to do right. But the wicked, the ungodly, they say, I hate that which is right. I do not delight in it. I want to do as I please. And it's funny because I look at our modern society, and we have a lot of wickedness, no doubt. But it's true that a lot of it is the more widespread stuff has to do with people, has to do with lesser things, right? But because God has directives that go down to our least behaviors on certain levels, like things that we would consider like, hey, why does God care about, the way they'd formulate it in the modern times? They'd say, who I love. Why does why does it matter who I love or make love to? Why does that matter? They would think like, because people often easily understand the idea of, hey, murdering, killing, stealing. Most people don't have a problem with that being wrong. Some people don't. I mean, the truly wicked obviously don't give heed to that. They think of themselves only, and and their profit, and so stealing and all those things are accessible to them because that is, they have not conscious, or their consciences, as it is written in the New Testament, are seared with a hot iron, and they become desensitized to the wrongness of what they do. And a lot of things are like that. Even the minor things we do, the things about, as they say, love. A lot of it doesn't have to do with love. God wants you to love all your fellow men. The problem is people equate love with something much different, which is the activity that brings about children and all that. And it is not on the same level, I suppose, as many other things, such as murder. But in the end, right and wrong matter because they are right and wrong. And because on some level, some things can be arbitrary. But I think that part of what it means to be righteous is to be able to moderate our behavior, to control ourselves, and to be able to limit ourselves to things that are acceptable and things that are profitable. And because ultimately you will never be like a tree planted by the river of water, and whatever you do will prosper if you fill your life with ungodliness of whatever sort. Someone asked me, well, I forgot exactly what they asked me, but it was in a discussion on that subject with someone. And one of the things I said, it's like, if you just, if you're not on the right path when it comes to your personal behavior in the most intimate circumstances, you will never experience, and you can never experience, the fullness of life that is, by the very nature of human beings, that is the life for which we are crafted and made. Meaning, like, you think, people, nobody knows what happiness is, really. I mean, like people say, well, this makes me happy. It's like, the other doesn't. It's like, I suppose, as you say, but how do you really know? Any more than I might. People say, well, you don't know what makes me happy. True enough. But the human condition seems fitted for a particular kind of life, and that if that life is not lived, you would never know what you missed out on. Or what, you can't achieve the fullness of prosperity and of life in a way that's outside of what God has ordained. You just can't. I mean, you can't have natural children outside of nature, for one. You can't have natural children. I am in favor of adoption for people who adopt, but it's like, on some level, everyone wants to have some natural children. If not, some people I know, very nice people who have some natural children, and then they adopt other children. And that's fine. They're giving to people who are, they're helping out people who otherwise might not have such a good life. And that's fine. But, of course, they did have the natural children because there was some desire to create natural children. And natural children are a special kind of delight. Along with being married for a long period of time, if you can. It's not about just being married. Some people are married for a long time and they're just miserable in it. And that's a tragedy. But unless you've experienced it where you are with someone for a long time and experience what ends up being greater and greater happiness and contentment in that, you can't really judge it. Just because people judge things based on the failure of others and their own fear of failure. And I say the way of God is not happy. I can't be happy in the ways of righteousness. I can't find joy and peace in the ways of righteousness. I can only find joy and peace in the ways of ungodliness, because I want to fulfill all my lusts and desires. But they don't know what they don't know what they speak of. Their ways will not stand, and they will receive some measure of pleasure, no doubt, and of some measure of happiness, but not equal to the measure of happiness and life and fullness of life that you could achieve through giving heed to God's direction in every aspect of life, even in those ways which seem not obvious to our modern sensibilities, why they matter. I'm trying not. I don't want to talk about things. I don't want to cue in algorithms by using certain key words. But there are so many ungodly ways of living these days, you can put into it anything you like. Therefore the ungodly shall not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. They can't, and why would they want to? If you spend your whole life pursuing ungodliness, why would you want to be, I often say, I want to be, when I enter into God's kingdom, I don't want to enter into it like it's the first godly day of my life. Or it's like, well, I guess now I got to start acting right. First, because there's a first for everything. First day in heaven, first day of trying to seek righteousness. I wonder what it's going to be like now that I'm perfect. I don't want it to be this strange experience. It's like, wow, I'm so used to sinning. This is strange. Because on some level, I don't think that's possible. I don't think you can just keep living sinfully and then just waltz into God's kingdom, But on the other hand, He knows our frame, and we're not like Him yet. We know we will be like Him. We are not righteous like we want to be, but we delight in the law of God. I may fall short of God's law, but I still assent to God's law that it's right. It's right, and I delight in it. I delight in the right ways. I said, if you find delight in God's law and the scriptures and all that, you have something precious. It's so hard. Like, how do you teach someone who is ungodly to delight in the law of God? They don't want to. It's like so hard to teach someone who doesn't want to learn something, who doesn't want to think something or feel something. People go around trying to persuade people of things. It's one thing when someone has no opinion, but trying to persuade someone who has a strong opinion is exceedingly difficult on anything. It's a project that is very difficult to undertake. And godly shall not stand in the judgment. And again, notice he says, stand in the way of sinners, sit in the seat of the scornful. There's this idea of stand in the judgment of sinners, in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation, right? To stand in the congregation. So that means to stand up. To stand in the judgment means to it indicates an idea of like, hey, they're not going to withstand God's judgment and stand up to God's standards. And therefore they're going to fall. In the judgment they shall fall. All must stand before God. All must stand before God in judgment. But when the judgment comes down, when the condemnation comes forth, that's where they fall. That's where they do not stand any longer. We stand for judgment means to be prepared to judge. But ultimately, like it says, we all must appear before the judgment seat of Christ. But there's another judgment. There's the great white throne judgment, where all stand and are judged, and there is condemnation. So when it says they will not stand in judgment, it means they will be condemned in judgment. They will not continue to stand when they are judged. For the Lord knoweth the way of the righteous, but the way of the ungodly shall perish. The way of God knows the way of the righteous. He knows their ways. He recognizes, acknowledges them. But the way of the ungodly is not a way of everlasting. It is not a way of life. It is not a way that persists. And like I say, in some sense, if you continue, the idea of like the wicked persisting in hell for all eternity also sort of implies that wickedness persists for all eternity. Because they don't repent in hell. No, if anything, they would curse God forever. I mean, on the days when they're not pleading for mercy, they would be cursing him. And so sin would just keep going in the way of the ungodly, right? I know there's other ways to explain it in their terms. But it's like after a while, if you keep explaining things away with something so simple as a wave of the hand and say, well, that's just symbolic or that's just metaphorical. The more frequently you do that to scriptures, it ought to make you think about it. I'm just saying. I came from the traditional point of view a long time ago. Used to be what I believed. And I don't get it. The way of the ungodly shall perish. It will not prosper them, and it will not itself prosper as a way to be, as a way to exist and to live and to continue. We will start this chapter. I didn't think we would just continue Psalm 1 for a whole hour, but hey, it's mostly an hour, but that's okay. They're somewhat connected. Like I said, the first several Psalms are all about man, the righteous and the wicked, the fall, right? We have like the answer to Genesis somewhat, as we talked about in the first one. We're not going to dwell on that. In fact, I was going to scan something and put it on there. I may do that yet. A Psalm of David. Oh, wait, wrong one. Psalm 2. Why do the heathen rage and the people imagine a vain thing? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us break their bands asunder and cast away their cords from us. Probably should have ended that sentence a little differently because it's like the end of the clause. Let us break their bands asunder and cast away their cords from us. The Lord, he that sitteth in the heavens shall laugh, the Lord shall have them in derision. So yeah, it's kind of a continuation of the same thought. The wicked are not so. The wicked do not have the way of life. Their lives will not persist. And ultimately, like I said, it's not just this world. It is life as a concept. The way of the wicked shall perish. Not just now. The way the world works now, there is the life and death, there is a correspondence to the way it works ultimately. Death is not, the second death is not some sort of major different thing than what you see of things that die now. They die and they are no more. Now people have thoughts about what they think happens to people, but I'm just saying the way we experience death on the earth is not about what we think happens to them after their spirits flying off or whatever. We think about And then the Old Testament, like it says, I make my bed in hell. I make my bed in the ground. Why did the heathen rage? The nations is probably what that is. I'm guessing that's nations. But it's, because remember, the nation Israel was God's special people. And the rest of the nations knew not God. The Goyim, the nation, the people. Or not Goyim, Goyi. That's from where we get the idea. You may have heard the term Goyim. Means the nations. You understand from the Old Testament why the Jews of Jesus' time kind of had a certain attitude about the nations that know not God. What's the people? Just the people. The heathen, the nations, rage. And then again, the word, where am I? Oh, that's that. The goy, that's the nations. It just means the nations. Interesting. I'm not going to read it, but you can see it right there. Ragash is tumultuous, to be in tumult or commotion. Ragash, rage. So again, it's a lot of times we see rage, we think anger, right? But it means there's tumult, there's commotion, there's not necessarily rage, but it's like, and why do the heathen, why are they in an uproar? Why do they imagine a vain thing? Let's see, vain thing. I assume that means imagine. Haga. Yeah, it's muse. On his word doth he meditate day and night. Remember Psalm 1, I said, it's the same word as imagine here. In Psalm 1, remember last time we talked about how the first word of where it says, he doth meditate day and night. Oh, wait, no, that's not the same one. Wait a second. Haga? Oh, I should see. It's the pronunciation that's throwing me off. So that one, Haga, yeah, it's the same word. I'm actually switching between windows. You can't even see it. As you can see here, and this is the usefulness of the Englishman's Concordance over here. If you go down, Psalm 1, verse 2, he meditates day and night. And Psalm 2, verse 1, the people imagine a vain thing. They imagine, the people of God meditate on the law of God day and night. The people, the implication, the wicked people, the nations who know not God and who do not fear God, they are in a tumult, and so they don't have peace. They are not like a tree planted by the river of water, but they are a tumult. They're in upheaval, and they meditate upon things that are vain, which probably means something like empty. Yeah, reek, it means empty. I'm not going to bring up the word definition, just trust me on that one. It means empty. Please. I just can't look at that all the time. All right. The things they imagine, the things they meditate upon are emptiness. The law of God is for fullness. The meditations of men are empty. The heathen are in tumult. Why? Well, think about it. People get tumultuous over all kinds of things. They get upset. I was thinking, it struck into my mind. I remember reading this in a book on it was like random trivia or something like that years ago. How that during the time of the Soviet Union, this is going to sound like a weird thing to say, but whatever, that the show Columbo with Peter Falk, the detective show, was very popular in Yugoslavia. They had it translated, and it was very popular. And when the show was canceled, they thought the government had censored it because there's communism and censorship, and they rioted because of this. They rioted because their TV show they thought was canceled. And well, they thought the government was behind it. Like, it wasn't really canceled. So, in so much so that they had to have Peter Falk, the star of the show, make a televised announcement announcing to the Yugoslavians that the show was indeed canceled. All right? And I'm just saying, like, that seems like a silly thing to riot over. No, it isn't on a level. I mean, because the people value their freedom. They don't like the idea of the government censoring things. But, but the point is, like, the government's always censoring things, but it took a television show to get them out in the streets. Fascinating. It shows you how people, they take their small comforts, That's why it's interesting. While, during the run up to the pandemic, right? The thing, I went to the store, and of course, the first thing to disappear was toilet paper and soap. Whereas one day when I went late to the store, and it was right before our state got locked down, and that was the only day that the entire vegetable section was cleared out because everyone went shopping that day. I'd already done it. That's too slow. I'd already done my shopping. I mean, maybe I could just do the whole Bible study like this. Anyways, I'd already done my shopping. I'm fixing that while we talk. I already done my shopping, so there was no I wasn't like, it wasn't like I was put out, but I was like, okay, well, I guess tonight I don't get any vegetables. But I mean, for the most part, and everything, it was interesting to me the things people would leave. But, they grab after things that maybe are not the most important things. Toilet paper can be improvised, though, a lot of those improvisations are maybe not so great. You have a newspaper, it's maybe not the best way to substitute, right? So, but that, our meditations are vain. In modern society, I certainly see this. I mean, it's like we think about, I see people sit around, they talk about, like, how horrible it is that our comic books are being ruined by feminism. Or, I'm trying to think of some other vein. I don't pay that much attention. So it's like hard for me to imagine, to know what people's minds are on. But, we think about things that are not so important, not so grave, that are ultimately empty, and they're not life-giving, life-sustaining. They're just to be consumed on our lusts, for our pleasures, and then discarded. They don't last. As I say, the people who say, I'm happy because I'm fulfilling my lust. You have no idea how happy you could be if instead you obeyed God and sacrificed a bit of your lust for the sake of something bigger and better and more worthy of your attention and of spending your life building. And then at the end, looking back at all you had done, even if it was, because the thing is, I don't know. It's hard because the people you see very often, like on television, I have television, or on the internet, right? People who come up and are seen are often seen by so many. They're very successful. And they have a lot of different success, so their lives can look much more fulfilled than perhaps they really are. And maybe they are more fulfilling than they are for people who are not famous and successful. But even then, you still see, it's like nobody gets on camera generally and talks about how horrible and miserable their life is, except for people whose lives are truly miserable, and there's no arguing. It's like, my life is horrible and miserable. Certainly people who are successful, there's no sympathy. When people are rich and famous, people don't have a lot of sympathy for them saying their life is terrible. They're like, oh, come on. But oftentimes it is. Oftentimes they are not fulfilled. They're still seeking. They're still questing. And honestly, they wouldn't even know fulfillment if they saw it, because they don't know how people don't know what to judge it against. They don't know how fulfilled they could be. So they settle for something that's less fulfilling. And then when those minor things are taken away, they are in absolute tumult. They are in the commotion of those small things, not exceedingly important things. The loss of those things drives them insane. You know, what do you mean I can't have my whatever thing that isn't really essential to life? They become so, their happiness becomes dependent on things that are so unfulfilling, and then they lose them, and what do they have left? I mean, like Jesus said, they build their house on the sand. I mean, like a house, and it's not a house built on a rock, where it's on some level. If you properly build your life around the Lord and His direction, you end up with a contentment and happiness that ultimately cannot and should not be shaken by any life events, at least at the core. You may have temporary setbacks, you may have difficulties, you may have various other ways you can be touched in this world and suffer loss, emotional distress, and all that. But at the core of it, you have something fulfilling which cannot be taken away. So that ultimately, no matter how hard the wind is blowing, your roots are still in the deep waters. You know what I mean? No matter how things blast outwardly, no matter what the world is throwing at you, you have your roots in deep water. And you cannot be moved. You are not in turmoil, but you are in peace. And just in closing, what I'm saying about like what the wicked, their meditations, they don't want to take God's direction. Let's break the bands of God. I want to break free from God's restraints. The scripture I played at the beginning, I believe, was the one that says, "The bands of the wicked have robbed me." The wicked have their own bands, things that they're stuck in, things that bind them and prevent them from having their, let's say, the most fulfilling lives possible. And as God gives direction towards a life that is a true life worth living, they say, no, we do not want to have those bands upon us. And again, David is probably thinking, if this is a psalm of David, which it probably is, I don't think it's attributed to him, is it? But in a sense of like also that the Lord rules, but as David ruled over the people of the ancient Near Middle East as God's anointed king, Christ is also the anointed king, right? And they say, hey, we don't want to obey Christ. We don't want to subject ourselves to his rulership, to his directions. We want to go our own way. We see pleasure over here, immediate pleasure. We don't want to wait for heaven or for later in our life. We don't want to subject ourselves to any form of sacrifice of our own pleasure for now, that we might have something better in the future. And it's not just about heaven; it is also about this life. Because like I said, there was a life I was living, and once I gave up, and I was heading in a certain direction, and I gave it up to go after the Lord and to live a different life. And boy, what a good decision that was. Everyone in some way is going to be bound, is going to have chains on them. Because you live by the sword, you die by the sword. You live by your passion. Your life is tied into your passion, and your happiness is bound up in the things which you're passionate about. And what happens when that's all taken away? What do you have left? But in God, I have something that can never be taken away. In the law of God, in my passion for Him and it, I have security and passion which cannot be taken away by the world or by anything that happens in it. In fact, in spite of everything in the world that goes on, it carries me through everything. The wicked they take counsel, they figure out how can we just relieve ourselves of these burdensome moral restrictions which we have from our fathers because of Christianity. This started like 50 years ago. 50, it's more like 60 years ago now. Back in the good old 60s, right? That is like, makes me think of this. Hey, we want to cast off all the restraints. We want to have a liberation of morals and from moral constraints. And they found it. And here we are today, where things get weirder and weirder. And now, notice that isn't it interesting that the destruction of personal morality has resulted in the construction of now a more general tyranny from society and from the government and of people who want to make it not just tyranny of society, which I can deal with the tyranny of society. I don't mind people looking down their nose at me and saying, look at that old-fashioned fool. I don't mind that. But those people also want to use the power of the state to compel their immoral beliefs on other people. They want to compel and impose it. Anyways, we'll pick this up somewhere in Psalm 2. I'll figure out where I'll call the starting. Probably verse 4. I'll call that the start, but we will... I don't know. I feel like we covered it all right. We'll very quickly recap that. All right, so we'll pick it up at verse 4 tomorrow. Thanks for joining this study. Look forward to being back again tomorrow.
The bands of the wicked have robbed me, but I have not forgotten thy law. At midnight will I rise to give thanks unto thee because of thy righteous judgments, O Lord. I am a companion of all them that fear thee, and of them that keep thy precepts. The earth, O Lord, is full of thy mercy. Teach me thy statutes. Thou hast dealt well with thy servants.